So this is the third of the four panels for today. And this one is an interesting build on the previous two that we've had so far, where there was a foundation setting panel, the first thing this morning, and then the other one was talking about recovering voices. This one talks about the way in which, I think to an earlier question, way in which people are using archival materials or reusing them for contemporary projects. One of the things about American creativity, and especially here in the library, is that when we preserve historical records, we do so not just for the preservation of historical memory, but we do them because they have to be put into circulation again, made accessible through our various media platforms, websites, providing materials to scholars to write in a printed text, but also to enable people working in new media. I think there was a young person here earlier this morning who talked about that particular aspect of it. So there are ways in which we are seeking to enlarge the consciousness of these historical materials, and that's what this panel will take on. A couple of notes here. Zawadi Morris sent us a 10-minute introduction about her project, the C19 Writers Project, based in Brooklyn. You're going to see that for about, it's about a 10-minute excerpt from a piece she produced. She's off in Tulsa, Oklahoma, pitching her project to high-dollar funders, I think. Let's hope she gets as much as she possibly can for her project, because it's pretty amazing. But you'll also hear in this panel from my colleagues and friends, Kathy Kirst, former AFC staff member and folklorist, and David Taylor, who is an old friend of the library, who has worked and reworked and reused materials from the Federal Writers Project and its ancillary initiatives in his media productions. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And to that, so to kick it off, let me please bring up Kathy Kirst and talk about Sydney Robertson, the WPA California Folk Music Project.
Thanks, Guha. Hi, it's loud, is that okay? I'm a former staff member of the American Folklife Center as an archivist, folklife specialist, and I first discovered this collection, the WPA California Folk Music Project, when I was working here at the library. It was a Federal One project, co-sponsored by the Library of Congress and by the University of California. So, I should also mention that a book that I have written about this is being published by the University of California Press, and it'll be out next spring, basically called Sydney Robertson and the WPA California Folk Music Project. While in her young 30s, Sydney Robertson, collector of traditional music, single-handedly planned and directed a WPA project designed to survey musical traditions in Northern California. The result of this New Deal project generated an impressive multi-format ethnographic field collection called the WPA California Folk Music Project that includes 35 hours of recordings, many photographs, drawings of musical instruments, ample field notes, and reports to the WPA, and lively and gossipy correspondence to New Deal colleagues and friends. Oh, I didn't mean to move it on. Robertson later described in the 40s her New Deal folk music collecting efforts as a, quote, government songwoman who, during the resettlement administration in the South and Midwest in 1936 and 37, and after that in California for the WPA, collected hundreds of songs, traveling over 300,000 miles in 17 states, she claimed, on her own, in her car, with her instantaneous recording machine, her sleeping bag, and a dog. In her native California, she was determined to collect English, but mostly also foreign language songs, aware, of course, at the time of the problems she would have in doing so, both from WPA, actually from the Library of Congress that said, you know, you really should collect more English language songs, and also from other bodies like the Society of California Pioneers, who really were interested in Anglo music. Those were the pioneers to them. Robertson repeatedly emphasized that Anglos were actually much later to settle in California than Spaniards and Portuguese who had populated an indigenous landscape, and that the music of immigrants was rich, vibrant, and needed to be collected and to be understood as a representation of American music. Robertson defined folk song in the very broadest possible sense, and she would have appreciated Dr. Portelli's speaking about urban traditions, and she didn't draw a dotted line as to what she wanted to record in terms of traditionality or whatever. She wanted to document what people were actually singing in their homes, in their communities, in bars and churches, and at their festivals and celebrations. She often recorded in context with a lot of ambient noise. The WPA required that the project hire 20 staff persons, both to provide socially useful work for those on the relief rolls and to justify the hiring of a supervisor. She thus combed the relief rolls for people with foreign language expertise, musical background, and those who could help her find contacts to record. She also found photographers and draftsmen to assist in documenting the music making and the instruments. The range of foreign language recordings Robertson made is quite impressive, and most of the immigrant groups had never ever been documented before. They include selections in 12 languages from 18 European and Middle Eastern cultures, which make up 2/3 of the recordings. The rest are in English. I've chosen a few songs to sample so you can hear just a bit of this remarkable music. Mrs. Avila was a Portuguese Azorian woman on the WPA staff chosen by Sydney, who had a Portuguese radio program in Oakland at the time and helped Robertson to find performers to sing and to record. Here is Mrs. Lemos singing in Oakland, accompanying herself, a spirited Portuguese song pitying those who have no lovers, whose faces look like raw parsley or green lemons. And there's no time to hear the whole song, but just a little bit.
Oh, Laurentina, ó verde limão, quem não tem amores não tem coração. Oh, Laurentina, ramo de salsa crua, quem não...
Eleanor Rodriguez was a second-generation Puerto Rican. Here she sings a Puerto Rican lament, Bolero Sentimental, about the disastrous economic conditions of farmers on the island during the 1920s.
Sale loco de contento con su cargamento para la ciudad, ay, para la ciudad. Lleva en su pensamiento todo un mundo lleno de felicidad, ay, de felicidad. Piensa remediar.
That's fine. Oops. Oh, there. Bedros Haroutunian. Robertson collected many recordings from Armenian performers in Fresno, many of whom settled in California after the Armenian genocide of 1915. Haroutunian was a member of Aslanian's Armenian Orchestra. Its leader, Jack Aslanian, claimed the group could play in 5 languages: Armenian, Turkish, Greek, Arabic, and American jazz. And I should just mention, in looking for next of kin of some of these performers, I didn't find next of kin of Mr. Haroutunian or Aslanian, but I did find an oud player who had played as a 13-year-old in the orchestra during the 40s with this same group. And so that I've tried to do research in that way of following up to see who might have known these recordings, these performers, or played with them. Giuseppe Russo was a Sicilian who also sang a number of Neapolitan songs like this one, a tarantella about a man who wishes for more than a kiss from his sweetheart.
Napoli bella stinga, sto cuore rugna te, tu dammi un basile, ti voglio bene ne. Napoli bella stinga, sto cuore rugna te, tu dammi un basile, ti voglio bene ne. Io non voglio basillo, son mecerillo, piano pianillo da voglio azziccà, tu mi baciaste e poi t'arraggiaste e poi mi dicevano...
Mr. Colyonen and his wife had a cafe in Boomtown, which was later called Central Valley. It was a hastily formed settlement that sprang up at the site of the construction of the Shasta Dam in 1937, when migrants rushed from the Midwest for jobs. Mr. and Mrs. Koljonen sang some songs in Finnish, their native language, or the language they learned. Mrs. Koljonen was actually born in Finland, but Mr. Koljonen was born in Minnesota. He also sang a humorous dialect song, Song of a Disgusted Swede.
All right. Okay. Shall I say the name?
Yes, say the name. Your name. It's a little bit of talking.
This is Song of a Disgusted Swede. I've been working in North Dakota. I've been here just one whole year. I go back to Minnesota just to see that big state fair. I go back to Minnesota just to see that big state fair.
John Stone was a gold miner who played fiddle and harmonica. Robertson had a hard time tracking him down where his shack was in the Sierras. She apparently had to take a boat down a little river, and he never was there, but she finally met him. He also sang songs and comic routines that he knew from his role as a come-on man in medicine shows in previous years. Ward Ford was a singer that Robertson had met with his extended family of singers in logging territory in northern Wisconsin, where she had recorded them for the Resettlement Administration in 1937. During the late 30s, Ward and his two brothers went west to work on the Shasta Dam, where she was able to document more of their wide repertoire of Civil War ballads, love songs, body and humorous songs that were also a hit with the CCC workers. Here he is singing a song that I especially like.
This song Barney McShane learned from my brother Bogue, who learned it from Walt Culver of Boulder City, Nevada. When the clouds begin to gather and the thunder it did roll, down the lane came Barney McShane, and just as he was passing by the widow Aaron's door, what a shame it started to pour. And he looked in there so longingly at that comely with his gait, when she hollered, Barney, darling, won't you wait? You ought to come in out of the rain, Barney McShane, and sit down until the sun comes out again. It's a cup of tea I'll brew, just enough for me and you, and we'll cuddle up together and we'll talk about the weather, Barney dear.
So this is just a very, very small selection of songs. There are songs about, there are homesick songs, there are Armenian songs about horrific things that happened in Turkey and in Armenia. There are the pain of life, the pain of love, the joy of love, the Armenian songs of saying, my daughter wants a Ford salesman for a husband. Why? You know, so sort of a commentary on American life for immigrants or who had either been born in the United States or who had come during their lifetime. In conclusion, I'd like to say that the California Folk Music collection provides a vast set of recordings representing a range of traditional and popular music collected during a very dynamic era of American culture. It also gives us a glimpse of an energetic and capable woman folk music collector who, through the existence of the WPA, had the opportunity to carry out a significant folk music collecting project that she might not have been able to do. The songs she documented provide commentary on all parts of life of regular Americans from many backgrounds in California. Her successes in the California Folk Music Project fit well with the New Deal dynamism and creativity that generated similar cooperative efforts to document and validate the lives of exemplary, yet so often unsung Americans. Also, her field work is exemplary. It's very deep. The record sleeves that she recorded on are covered with scribbles that she did while she was, making the recordings. Mr. Graham is flustered by the antics of the photographer, or, just comments about the recording, or that there's a false start. So her contextual information about that, and also her approach, her participatory, her interest in being participatory in terms of working with the performers, being careful not to say, when did you come from Italy? Or, in your first meeting. She counsels her WPA staff about all sorts of things that seem very modern. And it's an amazing collection, and I have absolutely adored working on it. And I should mention that the archival materials are partly in the American Folklife Center, the recordings and a lot of things, the photographs, and in the music division as well, where there are several Sidney Robertson Cowell. She married the famous Henry Cowell, who is a famous American composer, so the music division has some of her materials as well. Her letters are wonderful and evocative, and her perception of the people that she is recording and her curiosity about why they make music and what it means to them, it comes through very clearly throughout her materials. So thank you very much.
Please make welcome David Taylor.
Thanks, Guha, and it's like others have said, it's a real honor to be here, and I want to thank you also and the American Folklife Center for both curating, maintaining this collection, and also having this kind of gathering is really rare. I think the last time was about 15 years ago, but again, sort of to bring it attention to the public and to other scholars, and it's really exciting to be here and to hear so much that's happened, so much recent work. I'm a freelance writer. I come to the WPA and to the Writers Project in that way. I mean, my first exposure was for a Smithsonian Magazine article about pretty much the WPA guidebooks, and I came with the sympathy for the perspective of those who approach their task with all the uncertainty of freelance work, that they would have that work continuing from month to month, that their supervisor would be the same or different, and so much uncertainty of their lives at that time, that they managed to create the archive that we continue to mine is amazing to me. I've had the good fortune to work with the Writers Project material for public audiences, starting with that Smithsonian Magazine article, and that spawned a book and the NEH-funded documentary called Soul of a People, directed by Andrea Kalin, which aired on the Smithsonian Channel. And I appreciate Sarah including my essay in the new anthology, and it's really great to read all the pieces there. I'd like to pick up on what some have said about the kind of the political and cultural context of how the project's work created the archive, and the context we are in now, and in listening to the archive. And I love the idea of, as Dr. Portelli said, of the Writers Project is really more of a huge listening project. I think that's a great way to capture it. And it made me think also, as he was speaking, about a line in his and reverberations, he also mentioned. And I think that's a big part of what my work and the work with Spark Media. I'm happy a couple of members of the team are here as we plumb this for a new podcast. In listening to this, one thing Dr. Portelli writes in his book about called Hard Rain, about his encounters with Bob Dylan's music and oral history, is he notes that how a hard rain's going to fall, and Lord Randall from another era, they represent kind of a dialogue between equals. That the 1962 popular song is not privileged over the older expression, or vice versa. And I feel like that's part of what we get at with the Writers Project's archive, and how we engage as media producers with it now. He writes also that when we hear those two things together, we hear the echoes and dissonances between the two. That those echoes and dissonances can open up something else, something new, a more complex understanding, and a new enjoyment of both. So we see that, I feel like, in the archive in so many ways. For example, in the field recordings of Zora Neale Hurston and Stetson Kennedy in Florida, one tour that they did that Hurston led in 1939, some of the songs they recorded going down the Gulf Coast have resurfaced in decades in popular music. They were setting up a dialogue, I feel like, that we continue to hear. So it was during the pandemic that I partnered again with Andrea's team at Spark Media to bring more of that story into the public sphere, and with a podcast that's now coming up this summer called The People's Recorder. And with Chris Haley as host. He's a historian and archivist at the Maryland State Archive. So we're plumbing earlier and recent interviews and archival material in new ways, and it's exciting to work with. We're funded by grants from the NEH and 5 state humanity councils. So in that sense, there is the public funding is going into, if not a new federal writers project, there are channels and ways in which we can get a public public support for this, as Catherine was mentioning also. I'm excited to share that our first season of 8 episodes will be up later this summer. So actually, I will take this moment to please ask you to take out your silenced phones and actually type in peoplesrecorder.info, and you can sign up and get email just when alerts of when it is available. We're not going to bury you in a lot of email, but please do sign up. It's as of just today. I think you can find it also on Audible and on iTunes. So. This is starting a dialogue, I feel like, with you all as the starting point in listening and responding and sharing further. And we'd love to hear from you as you listen and as more people come on. This is, as I say, this is the first season. We're putting in applications to get more funding for subsequent seasons, and I hope that a lot of the research and what we've heard today will be reflected in those. As we'll see in Zawadi's presentation, her video, the inequalities and polarization highlighted by the pandemic and the disruptions of 2020 mirrored long-standing conditions in American society. In the podcast, we're looking at individual stories within the project, both during its time and how those recordings and stories are in dialogue with our time. And so again, echoes and dissonances abound. In Florida, one of the early episodes, we do follow Hurston's experience despite her treatment by the state office and the resistance of that she faced in recording Black life in Florida in authentically, she found a way to get support for important ethnographic work and harness the power of the Library of Congress and its state-of-the-art recording equipment. And take that into a cultural context.
The mandate of the Writers Project
that
was
she knew.
The mandate of
and on the Gulf Coast and making an enduring record. So actually, yes, if you could play a clip from that episode.
The mandate of the Writers Project was to create a national self-portrait, warts and all. That was a mission that most of the project staff took to heart, including Zora Neale Hurston and a young white writer named Stetson Kennedy. In the hot summer of 1939, they set out on a recording tour, leaving in 2 separate cars. Their destination was a harsher side of Florida, on a route that Hurston mapped out.
In those days, the Jim Crow system was all pervasive and ruled over all. That meant, among other things, that we couldn't travel together on field trips, black and white, much less black and white, male, female. So we sent Zora ahead as a scout to various locations to identify informants. Quite often we would arrive on the scene with the recording machine. She would still be there. And that was the case of the Aycock and Lindsay turpentine plantation in Cross City, Florida in 1939.
Kennedy followed Hurston's car along dirt roads into the deep pine forest west of Gainesville. They stopped at a cluster of barrels and shacks among rows of trees, a turpentine work camp. One of Florida's oldest industries, turpentine was distilled from pine tree resin, the same way syrup came from maple trees up north. Except this work camp was run by forced labor. The business of recording stories at the work camps was a dangerous one. Camp owners were wary of outsiders, poking around and asking too many questions.
It was like entering a foreign country, you know, you had to get almost a visa to get into a turpentine camp. We told the camp operator that we were interested in collecting plantation songs and spirituals and so forth. So he thought that was okay, and otherwise anyone trespassing is, you know, could be shot.
At the isolated camp in the Pine Woods, Hurston and her crew asked turpentine worker, James Griffin, to tell the story behind his song, Worked All Summer Long. Griffin was in prison for 3 months doing hard labor in a county prison camp. His crime? He was a few days late paying the rent that the company charged workers for bare-bones shelter. From the heartache of injustice, Griffin made up a blues. Listen closely and you can hear a young Stetson Kennedy inviting Griffin to share his personal anthem.
All right. We all sang it after I went out there and started to sing it, which that would be my theme song.
Well, we would appreciate it very much now if you go ahead and sing it just as you all sang it then.
Okay. Well, my dear mother, she prayed this prayer for me. My dear mother, she prayed this prayer for me. She says, Lord, have mercy on my son, wherever he may be.
These recordings at Carl City documented a form of slavery that continued out of public view. More than 70 years after slavery was outlawed, these work camps still held thousands of Black Floridians captive. Today, most people don't know these horrible camps even existed, but they made a searing impression on Wakulla County based.
Yeah, so that besides Hurston and Kennedy, and of course you hear Stetson Kennedy kind of some playing with his role in that recording venture. We also hear later more from Hurston and from historian Tamika Hobbs about oral history and Black communities in Florida now. and the episode highlights the archive's dialogue with public media. The People's Recorder also features less-known stories in the FWP. So in Wisconsin, we go into an initiative to document the Oneida language, a branch of the Mohawk, led to a lineage from Oscar Archiquette and other Oneida members of the project who recorded stories of elders in the Oneida language. Archiquette became fascinated with their history and inspired others in the community as a way of seeing that history could affect, how the Oneida govern themselves. And so he had an effect on two people we interviewed later, Gordon McClester and Loretta Metoxen. Gordon did WPA-style interviews on video in the 1990s with another generation of elders, and I loved hearing him talk about his passion for that work. And he passed on that version of both his passion and of history and humor to a young man he coached named Charlie Hill. And Charlie Hill used a subversive take on white history through a Native lens to make his name in stand-up. And so he became the first Native American comedian to perform before a national TV audience on The Tonight Show. And so his performances and his acts speak directly about and to that Oneida history. And so we hear in the episode both his art from the 70s and 80s alongside the archive of the Writers Project. And I feel like it continues that dialogue of placing history and putting these narratives in conjunction with each other. So that's what our project, the People's Recorder, is about, the people of the Writers Project, what it achieved, where it fell short, what it means now. And each episode traces stories of a few individuals as a lens for seeing what unfolded. In California, one of the people we follow is Harry Partch, erstwhile hobo, for a while FWP guidebook editor both in California and Arizona, and later composer. Partch is generally still known. He was long viewed as an iconoclast who made up new scales and invented his instruments. But listening now, I mean, he's gotten another view of him. There's a sense that we listen now. We talk with his biographer Andrew Gannade, and his Partch's experience and his personal journals. We can hear his iconic things like U.S. Highball differently now. It's actually the Library of Congress selected that for a National Recording Registry as a musical document of a community where he first felt truly free. California also holds other stories of both Asian American writers and artists who come into our story. Also the story of Tilly Olson, whose fiction later marked a milestone in writing about women's lives. Her story, I Stand Here Ironing, is a classic, but her time with the FWP is less known. And then we explore that. We get to talk with that with novelist Mary Gordon and about Tilly Olson's effect on generations after that. So these stories, including Margaret Walker, seen here in a mural showing her on a school in Jackson, Mississippi, give us a way to explore contemporary issues through different vantage points. And we see in things like the local versus the national and discussion of diverse voices and censorship and the polarization we see in society now, how many issues that Americans grappled with in the 30s are still obviously very much with us. I'd like to share just a little bit, one comment. So we're now at 80 years after the FWP, 40 years after it ended at an event in the New York Public Library. Ralph Ellison shared a commentary, and he was looking back, and the panelists were kind of a little hemming and hawing about really whether the Writers Project had much of an effect. And he got a little impatient and kind of in a burst finally said, let's face it, there is something called official history. Perhaps it's only academic, but you couldn't find the truth about my background in that history. You could not find the truth about other ethnic groups. And he added, one of the things that the WPA did is to allow the intermixture between the formal and the folk, the real experience of people as they feel it. We are a vernacular culture as well as a formal culture. And I feel like that gets at a lot of what we're looking at today, the formal study of these things that have been formally held in the archive, and how we take that out into the world, how Ellison did and other artists that we've been talking about. And so I've been glad to hear that conversation start. And thanks to a New York Humanities Council recording, you hear Ellison say that in the podcast. So I feel like that is one area that deserves more focus and more discussion. Maybe we can do that now, but continuing the influence on later generations of creatives and that discussion of that creative glue that provided then and that it continues to foster. So I'm very happy to see everyone here really as the start of a longer dialogue that will continue, and I hope you will listen wherever you get your ears fed. And thank you. Look forward to the conversation.
So now I'm going to play the video that Zawadi Morris sent. Please sit back and listen as she speaks about the project.
Greetings, participants and colleagues of the Federal Writers Project Symposium. My name is Zawadi Morris, and I am so honored to be a part of today's gathering. I am a Chicago native and a 25-year resident of Brooklyn. I am also the founder and publisher of BK Reader, a digital daily news source that covers the 2.6 million residents of Brooklyn. And I am the executive producer of the COVID-19 Writers Project. When the coronavirus initially struck New York City, while the majority of the population quarantined, news publishers, writers, photojournalists, and reporters were in the streets. We were on the ground daily, braving personal risks to provide firsthand reports. During the initial days of reporting on the pandemic, it became apparent that a wide disparity in the virus existed. While affluent individuals hoarded supplies and sought refuge in their secondary residences, subway workers continued their essential duties. Middle-class families in Brooklyn could safely quarantine and maintain their jobs remotely, whereas the service class either had to continue working through the pandemic or were furloughed without pay. Within weeks, tens of thousands of New Yorkers were on the brink of a hunger crisis. I also thought about the Federal Writers Project and the oral archive of slave narratives captured right at the end of many of these formerly enslaved people's lives. It always fascinated me to know that had that oral history project not been commissioned from a national level, this very cataclysmic period of our history could have been perverted and told in a very different way. The voices of those who experienced the worst of slavery's devastation would have been muted. And as a journalist, I realized that while we endeavored to cover the pandemic with breakneck efficiency, that we were not thinking about the individual voices. We were so preoccupied with being reactive to the news that the individual was being swallowed whole by a much larger entity known as coronavirus. But what we were at such a critical juncture in our history and in such a state of reactiveness, we were about to lose the narrative. Because if there's anything that I've learned as a journalist, it is that how we recount our lives in retrospect is vastly different from the way we tell it at the moment. The COVID-19 Writers Project is a multimedia project that captures a hyperlocal viewpoint of the coronavirus pandemic from what is known as Ground Zero, New York City, and inside of the virus's hotspot, Brooklyn. Inspired by the Federal Writers Project that produced audio and written recordings of slave narratives, the COVID-19 Writers Project presents first-person oral and written narratives of 30 Brooklyn residents through Zoom video interviews, essays, and photography, captured and compiled over the course of 6 months, beginning March 2020 to August 2020. The clips you are about to see are video narratives of Brooklyn residents from Devastation 1 and 2 and Recovery 2. Each intro is narrated by a child as a jarring reminder that children were in the pandemic and were also impacted, even as quiet observers. You will hear from the Chief Health Equity Officer at the American Medical Association, a public housing resident, a dance instructor, a former drug addict who now washes car windows for a little change each day, and finally, a formerly homeless woman who has HIV.
A report released in early April found that Black and Hispanic New Yorkers were dying from COVID-19 at almost twice the rate of white New Yorkers. Consequently, Brooklyn, a borough with large populations of Blacks and Hispanics, also had the highest number of coronavirus cases. New York City Mayor de Blasio, at a press conference, pointed to pre-existing conditions and very clear inequalities in healthcare as reasons for the disparity. However, there were also those who worked inside healthcare who believed the root of the problem was far greater than America's healthcare system. They believed that although the disparity was most visible in health outcomes, the real problem was not isolated to healthcare and less visible to the naked eye.
The pandemic revealed to me, as it did with many other people, I think this lack of awareness and this invisibility of people in this country and people's experience. COVID elevated the conditions in which people live, the inequities in which they have, and how their lives aren't valued as human beings. And because it's so widespread across this country and the world, it's really hard for people to turn away from. They can ignore it, but it's really hard to turn away from in a way that they were able to before. And so the opportunity in it, and especially for us in the health equity space, is that we've been able to kind of really put our voice forward and express this is how we have been for a long period of time. This is not new. How people are able to care for themselves and be healthy, again, is very much rooted in their structures and the conditions and the opportunities and the power that they have within the spaces and places that they live.
Like I said, my sister's best friend, father and grandmother passed away. This like 2 weeks after each other, or the same week. That shook the whole family. So even though it was a pandemic, my mother was going to their house because, like I said, they family to us, and checking up on things. She couldn't, like, she was having like a panic attack. Her mother and her favorite brother passed away. So it's hitting people really hard. And I feel like Trump and everybody in his camp should really double down on stuff like this and talk about it instead of just blaming China, because that's exactly what he's doing.
I'm so sorry. It's very upsetting. My mom is the matriarch of my family, and we all love her so much. And before the pandemic, we were able to visit her. You know, I gave her massages, I sang to her. She has Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and she fell and broke her hip, so she can't walk right now. And I'm sorry, can't walk right now. And so she's in a wheelchair, and she really looked forward to seeing us. And when they shut everything down, I was not able to see my mom. I called every day. I tried to bring her food because she does not like the food in the nursing home.
When we say getting through something and getting back to normal, what would normal be? Last year's stuff, 10 years of stuff, 20 years ago? No, normal is me respecting you and doing the best I can. And each day I get 24 hours I get, because that's all I get at a time. And that's normal. Normal is being productive, creative, you know? That's what's gonna make the new change. The new change is gonna blossom in front of us. Nobody know it right now, but it's gonna blossom, because things die and they grow. Every season, new flowers come up. It blossoms in the newness. Sometimes it's fuller and stronger.
A lot of babies were born. I love that. I love that. I never had babies, but I love the fact that babies were born. It's such a blessing from our Lord. I believe in God so much. God has blessed me with so many things. Look, God blessed me with health. He's so awesome. He's so awesome. He's the greatest, you know? So I think God is so awesome. And I think God is working so hard right now. This whole thing, if people don't know, this whole thing is spiritual. You have to know it. That's all I know.
The aim of the project is to build an historical record of America's response to the greatest global health crisis of the century, while examining the extent to which socioeconomic outcomes are impacted by such factors such as healthcare, education, and race. From the formerly incarcerated to the college student, from the homeless shelter resident, these first-person narratives offer an inside view of the pandemic's diverse impact on America's citizens, ultimately helping to answer, what is the crisis telling us about who we are as a society today? The project follows a 5-point arc beginning with crisis, which is when the news of the pandemic first hit. Then it moves to response, which examines the government and public response to the pandemic. And then to devastation, a documentation of what was happening during the virus's peak. And then awakening, when civil and racial unrest and flat-out frustration sent people spilling out into the streets. And finally, recovery. After we had finally flattened the curve and we were attempting to reestablish some semblance of order. Interestingly, those 5 points, crisis, response, devastation, awakening, and recovery, mirrored the exact same arc one makes during death and grieving. In addition to photography, included in each flashpoint are essays written from the perspective of a professor, a doctor, a mother, a Gen Zer, and also award-winning novelist and New York Times bestselling author Sapphire of the book Push. More than 30 hours of footage have been distilled down to 2.5 hours across 10 videos that follow local residents through the pandemic's arc and feature a wide cross-section of oral narratives, from high school students to the elderly and shut-in, to clinical psychologists and medical professionals. As I think about the Federal Writers Project, all of the individual people it affected, their hardships, their wisdom, and its significance even today, what I've hoped to achieve is an archive of narratives captured in real time that we can look back on and learn from. There was so much I was able to take away in the making of this emotional project. But one thing that stood out most prominently for me was that the virus that we were fighting and continue to fight has evaded us because it is a manifestation of another virus that is embedded in the birth of this country. This virus lives in our institutions and the body politic, and as often as we've tried to inoculate it, it remains an undercurrent in our lives today. One might argue that with each strain, this particular virus gets weaker and weaker. Others might argue that it simply mutates and becomes stronger. Is it nature, or was it nurtured? Was it man-made, or is it actually mankind? The debate continues. But one thing is certain. Many people's lives have been devastated, ruined, and lost because of it, while other people's lives have been forever and positively transformed. And with this project, I intended for those lives, those voices, for better or for worse, to be heard.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Guha Shankar, Senior Folk Life Specialist at the American Folk Life Center. And I've been here close to 20 years now. And as I said earlier, one of the great pleasures and privileges is to be able to dive into the collections on occasion. Part of my responsibilities and also a great privilege, as I noted earlier. I'm going to jump right into the presentation right now and talk about a question I think that Catherine and others have raised as to exactly what else besides the texts are there that give us the experiences of a formerly enslaved people. I'll begin with the paid party political announcement and talk about the American Folk Life Center first, however. Since its establishment in the music division of the library in 1928, when it was known as the Archive of American Folk Song, and through subsequent iterations, The American Folklife Center's archive has sought to promote and sustain the cultural memory of the nation through documentary projects, recording expeditions, training programs, preservation activities, publications, and events like this one. The Center's unparalleled archival collection of ethnographic field documentation spans centuries, countries, continents, and encompasses virtually every recording technology invented to document the expressive cultural tradition, folkways, and historical experiences of individuals and communities across the nation and around the world. John Lomax, who took over in 1932 as the second head of the archive, and his son Alan, as we've heard, embarked on many collecting trips of their own while also supporting other ethnographers and other institutions in doing the same with loans of recording equipment, as we've just heard from Kathy Kirst. And they also gave guidance on using the technology and conducting field work. So there's a methodological issue which they were well aware of and did it right from the inception of their work at the library. In turn, the library received a swelling stream of seminal field recordings from every region of the country, and very soon after also from overseas locations. Pioneering field collectors included Vance Randolph, Charles Todd, Robert Sonkin, Eloise Hubbard Linska, Zora Neale Hurston, Herbert Halpert, and on and on and on. So by the time the Federal Writers Project was established by the Works Progress Administration in 1935, the library's folk song archive was already collecting broadly, wide, far, and deep. That brings us to the archive's audio recordings made with formerly enslaved people in the AFC collections. Among the most unique collections in the library and the center are the American Folklife Center's audio recordings with 23 individuals documenting the memories of the last living African Americans who have experienced the deprivations of chattel slavery. As you can see on the screen, the public-facing website. Is Catherine still here somewhere? Yes, there. There it is right there, Catherine. The public-facing website of the library, and you all may already be aware of this through your own research, so excuse the redundant information. The website aggregates recordings from several discrete collections, right? So I don't want to get into a tangle here because it can be a tangle, but for the sake of brevity, allow me to sidestep a very complex discussion we could have on the sprawl of projects the WPA and the FWP generated, and note that several of these collecting projects were indeed undertaken in the 30s and are therefore coterminous with FWP documentation of life histories and folk traditions. But in point of fact, only one initiative that includes the recorded voices of formerly enslaved African Americans was specifically undertaken for the Federal Writers Project. This may not be consequential for those folks who just want access to the content, but since what I'm also trying to say here, and what I think we've all tried to say in our own ways, is how do you use the archives? Going back to a phrase that was brought up earlier. You need to know that researching resources within the library is, that's not an unimportant fact to keep in mind, in that you have to look outside the very specific parameters of the topic that you're researching in order to turn up archival materials. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to provide a brief outline to the collections from which the audio recordings of formerly enslaved were made. So one of the first ones we received, this was this is American Dialect Society collection, which was created in 1932 and 1933, again, date-wise, in advance of the Federal Writers Project, right? And Lorenzo Dow Turner and of Fisk University recorded many folks from, especially speakers of Gullah Geechee down in Georgia and South Carolina. Again, we've come back to, I think David has already touched on some of these projects in another register, but Alan Lomax, Zora Neale Hurston, and Mary Elizabeth Barnacle recorded in 1935. Wallace Quarterman, for instance, in Fort Frederica, St. Simon's Island, Georgia. And then we have the American Dialect Society collections again. These were recorded in 1934 to 35 in Virginia by Archibald Hill and Guy Lohman for the Linguistic Atlas of the U.S. and Canada. This is something that I think David has used in his own work before. This is a Hampton Institute, a duplication project. This is Roscoe Lewis from the Hampton Institute, now Hampton University in Virginia. And he recorded, as you can see him setting up here in the field, recorded choirs of people singing songs that they knew in their days of enslavement. Parenthetically, that's the one that was actually directly sponsored by the FWP. The Lomaxes undertook field recording expeditions of their own, obviously, as staff members of the archive. And here in 1940, John and Ruby went down to Texas and recorded Billy McRae, Irene Williams, Bob Ledbetter, and Joe McDonald. They made a wide sweep right down through the southern states, and that material is also online. The Library of Congress undertook a project in 1941 with Charles Johnson, Lewis Jones, John W. Work of Fisk University, seminal African-American field workers and historians. Lomax provided the field recording equipment, and they recorded an interview with George Johnson. There's something about this particular interview which strikes me as interesting, and I think it takes better historians like the ones we have here to unpack this one, in which George Johnson speaks about having been enslaved, the property of Jefferson Davis. And he speaks in sort of highly glowing terms. Now, I'm not sure whether this is, again, that kind of obfuscation or the kind of self-preservation that Catherine and others have referred to, in which when confronted with white field workers, I think Lomax is part of it, and it may have been the case that perhaps the presence of the African Americans on the staff on the recording expedition didn't deter him from still praising Jefferson Davis. So there's a complexity to all of these narratives and these interviews, and again, have been detailed with great clarity by previous speakers, but to hear it in the actual voice of the people who were interviewed is really striking to me. And then here is an interview that John Henry Falk did with Laura Smalley of Hampstead, Texas, and we're going to hear this recording right now.
Well, do you remember any of the slaves being sold? Do you remember any slave sellers, men that would just buy and sell?
No, sir, I never did see it. I should have never did know that, We heard talk of it, but then I read that was after slavery, We heard talk of it. You see them talk about, putting them on stumps, or something high, and beating them off like they did cattle. Beat them off like they did cattle.
Well, none of your folks were ever sold, then?
No, sir, none of them never was sold.
You were born right there and never did leave.
Born right there and stayed there until I was about 9, 10 years old, maybe more. Stayed right there. We didn't know where to go. Mom and them didn't know where to go. You see, after freedom broke, just like you turned something out, Didn't know where to go. That's just where they stayed. Didn't know where to go. Turned us out just like, you turn out cattle. I say. Didn't know where to go.
Do you remember when the Civil War was being fought?
Well, I can't remember much about it, but I remember this much. When Mr. Bethany was gone a long time, looked like a long time, and I remember the next morning, when he got up, now don't knock that back there. When we all got up and all of them went to the house to see old master. And I thought old master was dead, but he had been off to the war and come back. But then I didn't know, went to the war. I just didn't know he was gone a long time. All the niggas gathered around to see old master again. And old master didn't tell it was free.
He didn't tell you that?
No, he didn't tell. They waited. I think now they said they wait them 6 months out of that. 6 months. And turn them loose on the 19th of June. That's why you celebrate that day. Colors folks. Celebrate that.
Okay. So, direct voice, which tells you about the reaction of enslaved people to the announcement of what's now June 19th. Those are the kinds of voices that you will hear and the kinds of experiences that are recorded in these materials, in these collections. To an earlier point, I guess I would say that I'm sympathetic to the critique of the way in which texts might have been, how do I say, keeps certain information aside or is deliberately obscured in order to protect the speaker. I'm also partial to the recordings, however, because there's an immediacy to the spoken word, which is quite different from the text and has an impact on the audience much different from that of the transcribed narrative.
Well, do you remember?
Whoops. And moving on, in 1941, Robert Sonkin interviewed Isa Mosley and Alice Gaston in Gee's Bend, Alabama. And finally, 1949, it's late 1949, Fountain Hughes is interviewed by Library of Congress staffer Herman Norwood. Elmer Sparks recorded an interview with Celia Black in 1974. Sorry, I didn't mean to say final. And then Charlie Smith in 1975. You've already seen some of the talked about some of the administrators of these projects. These are people who were really influential in the collection of these narratives. And the other thing that I also want to mention here is that as you do research into the collections, you will find administrative files, you will find the way in which methodology, collecting expeditions are set, retrospectively, what people thought about the purpose of those recordings were. And here's John Lomax, for instance, talking about the way in which he wanted stories and not necessarily answers to questions, which I think is something that oral historians still kind of hew to, is that notion that it's not the questions and the responses to those questions that are important, but the way in which experiences are unfolded in the course of the narrative. And finally, a question here was raised about use. One of the things that we've done is, a while ago, I took 3 of these narratives and made podcasts out of them. I hope to resume them some point soon. I'm certainly happy to play some of them, but it might be better suited might better suit the time here if you were to go to this particular website. It's called Voices from the Days of Slavery, Stories, Songs, and Memories, and listen for yourselves. With that, I'm going to end. Thank you very much. So we're going to have an intimate discussion among the 3 of us. And of course, I'm trying to keep my eye on the time here. So I guess I want to start with the question to Kathy. It seemed, Kathy, that the way in which Sidney Robertson, no, it's on, the way Sidney Robertson's work intersects with, say, Zawadi Morris's, which you just heard, in terms of what the purpose of her work was in terms of mediating between voices that are never heard and bringing them into the kind of the public sphere. Does that seem like an accurate way to say that?
Yes.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
It's on.
Yeah.
Yes, in a sense, but with recordings, it's a little different. I mean, she wasn't really interviewing. Well, sometimes there's, where did you learn this song, or, and sometimes just a little bit more. Actually, John Stone, the gold miner, said, well, what are you going to be using these for? Why are you doing this? And then she has a chance to.
Yeah.
I didn't think it was on, but anyway, I have a loud voice. So Sidney Robertson has a chance to say, well, we want to deposit these at the Library of Congress where people in the future can listen to them. And then he says, I wish I could play it for you, but it's like, so you mean people later on can listen to it. And it's a beautiful little snippet, but there's not that much in these materials. It's mostly recordings. And in a way, this collection, it's called California Gold, the California Folk Music Project, was the very first American Folklife Center's American Memory Collection. It was digitized and put up in 1995. And then all the recordings went up. The field reports and the photographs were also put up, but in a way, there's so much background in Sidney Robertson's field notes, her correspondence, her little pieces of paper talking about what happened, that just listening to the recording is not sufficient. And that for instance, negotiations with the Russian Molokan community on San Potrero Hill in San Francisco, this is a conservative, group of Russians who broke away from the Orthodox Church and sing this beautiful melismatic song format. And she was finally allowed to record in their church after meeting many times. But when you hear the recording, and even when you see the pictures of the Molokan community, you don't, in a way, it doesn't it's not all pulled together until you do that research in the archive. I mean, I suppose it could be done in a hyperlinked format, but I don't know if that addresses sort of what you're talking about.
David, I wondered if, as you were going through the archives, what struck you about the materials that you were coming across in Florida? What drew you to them particularly?
Well, I think both the context that the interviewers found, like going into a turpentine camp and realizing that that this institution, that the oppression had continued for 70 years after that. And in fact, there was an NPR report from 2004 saying the same kind of luring of marginalized people into that kind of indentured rural camp work was still happening even then. So I think that the endurance of that context, as well as, I mean, James Griffin's song is about his mother's prayer for him, is also just really resonant now. So I think that the echoes of both the structural situation then and what we hear now. The other thing I think that registered was how, a little bit what Dr. Portelli was saying about how interviews could affect the interviewer's sense of themselves, but also the interviewee gets, like you were saying, is like, oh, this will be listened to later. The sense that this is worth hearing. We get, in Florida, Tamika Hobbs was saying, when she was doing oral history, that was what she was struck by, that once that the people she was interviewing were adjusted to, telling their stories, they realized, they saw themselves differently as a result, so.
Thank you. In the interest of time, simply because we are coming up against the next panel, I'd like to throw it open for questions to the audience, if there are any. Oh, there's two, one there, one there. Go ahead.
Hello. Thank you, David, Catherine, Guha, Ms. Morris. I have a question for you all. My question is, what drives American people to hear and collect other American people's voices? I reckon once Sarah mentioned a one-man federal writers project in the connection with Stats Turkel, keeping collecting people's stories. Also, Ralph Ellison said in an interview that he desperately needed to hear other African American people talk by not going anywhere else, staying close to Harlem. Then the NPR National Story Project by Paul Auster could be understood in the same context, I suppose. So my question is, why? Because I'm a Japanese living in Japan, so this is very curious for me.
I'd say, why not? I mean, that's a flippant answer, but it seems to me that we're enlarging what we try and do within the American Folklife Center's archive, and it's in a DNA, is to represent the voices of people who've been marginalized, underreported, whose voices have been excluded, with all, and I keep Dr. Portelli's caution in mind about giving voice to people, but instead what I always suggest is that this is the space in which people can express themselves, which may not have been many of before. And I think similarly, if you listen to all of the perspectives here, it is a way to enlarge the American consciousness of the fact that there are others among us, right? That we're not all the same, that there's not homogeneous cultural traditions, that there are a multiplicity and a diversity of perspectives, and they deserve to be heard if we are to, do something called, if the American project is to survive and thrive, then that has to be part of the national sort of consciousness. That's the way in which I've sort of come to think about it, but my thoughts on that are evolving as well. So
yeah, just to jump on the support of that, that's, I think, and for the questioners, I think it was often how does they had the assignment of asking questions to see how the stories fit in, how they created identity. I mean, how they created both group and individual identity in a very heterogeneous society, and where many groups were not heard from. And I think that's what Ellison speaks to in saying, like, what we learn from telling these stories is about ourselves, and we're creating American, both individual and smaller group identity, but also we're creating American identity all the time. We're improvising American history.
Right. And I guess following on from that, the impetus to provide more space and to get more voices into the conversation is a push against those people who want to restrict those spaces, right? So there's a politics of the notion of collecting and to like doing this kind of work, and small p politics. But the point is that democracy, if it's not an ideal but an actual something that you aspire to and try to realize, it rests on these principles which say that voices should be heard. People's perspectives should be made part of a larger sort of a consciousness, a larger framework. Kathy, is it?
Well, yes. And I mean, in California, which is one of the most diverse states in the country, ethnically and culturally, I think it was very important for Sidney Robertson not just to record Anglo voices, sort of sons of the pioneers or the sons of the 49ers, because even the people who came for the gold rush came from Chile and Portugal and all over the world, and were quite a mixture of very vibrant musical traditions that came together, and to see them only as sort of dismiss them as if they are invisible seemed wrong, and the fact that most of these groups were never recorded ever before means that those families that come from Basque or Icelandic or Norwegian communities that came out of that in California can hear their forebears who are maybe citizens but are treated as if they are not Americans. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is a little complex, but maybe not so. There is a growing body. Oh, I guess I'll stand up. There's a growing body and offspring, so to speak, of the folklore and the oral history, with the descendants of the enslaved. And I'm wondering where that would fit with your projects, or is there a place, a home to which these descendants can contact you to share it with you? I'll cite an example that I know of personally because I led someone here to the resources. Thankfully, because you digitize the sources, William Sykes was interviewed and his photograph survives. So one of his descendants came here to Washington, D.C. and was able to look at the original typescript of that interview. Clint Smith of The Atlantic published an article in February of 2021 where he interviewed several of these descendants. However, it seems that we have the stories, we have the narratives, we have the descendants who have actually worked to research and authenticate some of those stories. How do we connect them so that future generations, especially the scholars who are talking about authenticating those stories, that they get that kind of documentation to enhance whatever scholarship they're working on?
That's a great question. You can certainly make a pitch and a talk to the acquisitions people here in various divisions in the library. There are many different special collections divisions here. Some manuscripts, for instance, as Barbara Baer has talked about earlier, collects textual and printed materials and graphic materials. You have to find an appropriate place in which these materials could be housed. But I would also say that we at the library also encouraged local organizations, local institutions to be the repositories for these materials, because it's quite one thing to say that there's a prestige attached to putting it in the National Library. But it seems to me also that it makes just as much sense for somebody, for an institution that's in their own backyard, for it to be accessible there. And maybe digitization can or can't bridge those kinds of gaps. Maybe we can share those materials. But I would also look broadly and not just to the center, and I say that advisedly because I'm an employee here at the library. It's not that we don't want the materials, but we're very cognizant of how much we can take on, and we're very cognizant of what it means to people back home, right? So we don't try to go hoovering up collections from across the country. Does that seem like a reasonable thing to say, Kathy? Or? Yeah, okay, thank you.
I guess just maybe in partnership with the library, I know that, for example, the Library of Virginia, historians from there, when they give talks about the collection to, for example, in Petersburg, they've been approached afterwards by descendants of those who had been recorded and those formerly enslaved, and made connections that way with the recordings and the materials that are at the state level and some of the state historical societies. I think in Oklahoma there's also an effort to make that available.
Thank you for the question.
A question for Guha and then just one for Kathy. Guha, I understand that your presentation prioritizes audio recorded voices of formerly enslaved Black Americans, but is there a chance that your interest might dovetail to include FWP narratives about the other slavery, that of Indian slavery in the American West? And then for Kathy, since we're dealing with California, did you come across any songs or ballads by Mexican American cultural producers? Thank you.
We're certainly interested. We do have collections of materials from indigenous communities dating back to the very first ethnographic recordings from 1890. The extent to which those move into the ideas of the deprivations that indigenous communities have suffered at the hands of U.S. expansion, imperialism, and so on, that's certainly something which is a very sensitive topic. And one of the things that we're very aware of and very keenly loath to do is to reproduce certain kinds of colonial forms of, again, in an enclosure by taking materials and getting them out of Native communities and putting them into the national center. We also don't do anything in terms of digitization, just to give you another example, that hasn't centrally been vetted by and approved by Native American communities themselves, right? So we don't want to go, again, poaching or encroaching upon Native American indigenous communities' cultural heritage. But if they approached us, or if somebody approached us and said, would you be interested in this collection, we would certainly make every effort to try and vet that in the best way possible. One of the things that's happened, I will say, is that indigenous communities increasingly are asserting self-control and control over their cultural heritage materials. So they want to be able to have access to their materials in their own domain and not have it in some other kind of white colonial institution. So we're very judicious about how we treat those kinds of collections. I don't know if that makes sense or not. Yeah. Okay.
And there are some recordings
Kathy.
of Mexicans.
Kathy.
Oh, there are some recordings of Mexicans performing, especially at a wedding, a Mexican wedding, in Carmel, I think, or Monterey. They're available online at the library here. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's going to be the last question there. Oh. Almost. Thank you, Greg. Yes, please.
Throughout the day, you've talked about whether it's time for a new writers project, and I'm wondering whether it's actually more because there's such a divide in the country now. Is it more a time for a readers project where you get people to read both sides and then come together, agree to read what you wouldn't read, discuss, and try to find some middle ground? I don't know how that would work, but a big book club or something, or.
Sure. I'm not a big fan of both sidism. I'll have to tell you that on a personal basis. This is my own personal feeling, not that of the libraries or anybody else's. Finding middle ground means that somebody wants to find middle ground with you. Somebody wants to find common cause with you, and all indications are to the contrary. That people want to find that middle ground. The places in which we stand and the way in which we approach this notion of a common wheel seems to have sort of pulled apart very dramatically which I think has been indexed by other people here, and that I think would be a great thing if a new Federal Writers Project could do that, or a Readers Project could do that. I'll leave that question burning somewhere else. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No idea offhand, but yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. We have to get going. Oh, dear. Oh, no. Thank you.